ideas could be as important weapons as anything. In the United States, every idea that wants to establish itself depends on public consent. And so we worked out the engineering of consent, which applies to any social goal. There are 431 different ideas aiming at you every day to do something different from what you did the day before. Anyone can practice it, whether he or she is a criminal, a nitwit, a liar, a truth teller, or completely ignorant of anything but wanting to make money. To gain belief is first through research to find out whether they respond to authority, to reason, to persuasion, or to tradition.
In the decades following the Second World War, America discovered a new science of persuasion. It was not the persuasion of rhetoric or logic, but of feeling, an invisible architecture built on the soft ground of the human psyche. Edward Bernays, a nephew of Sigmund Freud, believed that democracy could not survive on reason alone. The masses, he thought, were governed by irrational desires, fears, and subconscious drives. To make democracy stable, these forces had to be managed, channeled, and engineered. He called this process the engineering of consent. The premise was simple yet disquieting. If you could understand what people wanted beneath their awareness, their hidden anxieties, aspirations, and guilt, you could guide them toward choices that appeared voluntary but were, in truth, designed. In Bernays' world, the voter and the consumer were not so different. Both needed to be soothed and steered. His techniques were grounded in psychoanalysis, drawn from Freud's notion that civilization required repression of instinct. Where his uncle had sought to uncover the unconscious, Bernays sought to use it. From this synthesis emerged the modern machinery of public relations. Governments learned that fear could be molded into patriotism. Corporations learned that insecurity could be transformed into desire, and both learned that control could operate not through coercion, but through suggestion. The language of persuasion migrated from the podium to the billboard, from propaganda to advertising. Bernays' most striking insight was that emotional symbolism could sell anything: soap, cigarettes, even ideology. When he helped orchestrate a 1954 coup in Guatemala on behalf of the United Fruit Company, he framed the elected government as a communist threat, playing on Cold War anxieties until Americans accepted intervention as defense of freedom. The moral weight of the act was obscured by the elegance of its narrative. The revolution he began was not political, but psychological. For the first time, mass persuasion had a theory of the mind behind it. What Freud called the id, Bernays turned into a marketplace. The self became the new territory of governance. People could be made to feel free precisely because their choices were being shaped in ways they did not perceive. It was into this world that David Ogilvy would emerge, a man equally devoted to understanding what moved people, but determined to do so without deceit. If Bernays sought to engineer consent, Ogilvy sought to study conviction, yet the two were bound by the same question that still shadows modern persuasion. If the mind can be guided without awareness, where does freedom end and influence begin? David Mackenzie Ogilvy was born on June 23, 1911, in the quiet English village of West Horsley, Surrey. His family was not wealthy, though they carried the remnants of Victorian respectability, a father of Scottish descent and a mother of Irish lineage. His father, Francis John Longley Ogilvy, was a classic scholar turned stockbroker whose fortunes suffered with the economic shocks of the early 20th century. His mother, Dorothy Blue Fairfield, came from a line of Anglo-Irish gentry and carried herself with a discipline and refinement that never quite masked financial anxiety. Ogilvy would later recall that his childhood was genteel but impoverished, the kind of life in which books replaced comfort and pride disguised want. He grew up amid the subdued tensions of a family that valued intellect more than income. His father's business ventures faltered repeatedly, forcing long absences from home and periods of humiliation. But his father's stoic optimism left an impression on him. He bore misfortune with dignity, Ogilvy later wrote. I never heard him complain. His mother, by contrast, was demanding and precise, a presence that shaped the young boy's sense of order, tone, and correctness. She managed the household with an unyielding sense of propriety, teaching her children that appearances mattered even when means were meager. That early contradiction, formality without fortune, would stay with him throughout life and later emerge as the stylistic signature of his advertising, elegance without excess. Ogilvy attended St. Cyprian's, a boarding school in Eastbourne, where he began to develop a mix of defiance and self-control that would define him. He excelled in writing and languages, but chafed under authority. His teachers described him as brilliant but unruly. He absorbed the rhythms of rhetoric and the moral clarity of classical education, but he also developed an eye for human weakness. School for him was a laboratory of behavior. Every classroom was an experiment in persuasion, he once remarked years later, and every punishment a lesson in the management of appearances. The idea that the presentation of self was a form of survival, that one's image could determine one's fate, was planted early. He went on to Fettes College in Edinburgh, one of Scotland's elite schools, often compared to Eton for its rigor and conservatism. There, the contrast between wealth and intellect deepened. Many of his classmates came from titled families. Ogilvy, by comparison, was the son of a struggling broker, yet he thrived academically, winning a scholarship to Christ Church, Oxford, to study history. Oxford would have been the natural path to an establishment career, diplomacy, academia, perhaps the civil service. But Ogilvy did not finish his degree. The Depression hit his father's investments hard, and he left the university after 2 years to earn his living. The decision, which might have crushed a more conventional young man, liberated him instead. "I preferred the world to the library," he later wrote. That departure from Oxford marked the first of many moments in which he rejected pedigree in favor of experience. In 1931, restless and broke, Ogilvy went to Paris. He had no formal training, no plan, and no money. He took a position as an apprentice chef at the Hotel Majestic, one of the grand establishments of the city. The experience, though humbling, was formative. In the kitchens, he learned the precision and hierarchy of French discipline. Every movement was deliberate, every mistake costly. The chefs, he noticed, combined artistry with exact measurement. It was there he first recognized that creativity without structure produced chaos. He would later say that running an advertising agency was not unlike running a kitchen. Success depended on organization, timing, and the ruthless enforcement of standards. He was drawn to the ritual of excellence, the pursuit of perfection through method. In the kitchen, he wrote, "I learned that meticulous attention to detail can transform the ordinary into the remarkable." After a year in Paris, he returned to England and drifted into sales, taking a job selling AGA cookers, heavy cast-iron range ovens imported from Sweden. It was an unlikely apprenticeship for a future titan of advertising, but it became the crucible of his philosophy. Ogilvy proved astonishingly good at it. He went door to door across the British countryside, demonstrating the stove to skeptical housewives. He learned to watch their faces for the smallest flicker of interest, to listen for hesitation, and to adjust his pitch to their rhythms. "The prospect doesn't buy because you talk fast," he wrote in his famous AGA cooker sales manual. "She buys because you make her feel understood." The manual he wrote for AGA, a 30-page guide on how to sell, was so meticulous and psychologically acute that Fortune magazine later called it probably the best sales manual ever written. It turned him into a minor legend among British salesmen and hinted at the discipline that would later make his advertising so persuasive. What set Ogilvy apart was not charm or bravado, but observation. He watched people with a scientist's curiosity. He recorded what phrases elicited trust, what gestures closed the gap between hesitation and purchase. In selling cookers, he learned the grammar of desire, the subtle transformation of a product into a promise. That discipline of listening, of attending to the consumer's unspoken needs, would become the moral core of his later career. "The consumer is not a moron," he would famously declare. "She's your wife." Behind that line was not sentimentality but an ethic. Respect the intelligence of the audience. The Great Depression continued to erode the British economy, and by 1938, Ogilvy sought broader horizons. Through contacts at AGA, he secured a position in the United States with Dr. George Gallup, the pioneer of public opinion research. At Gallup's Audience Research Institute in Princeton, New Jersey, Ogilvy encountered the scientific study of persuasion for the first time. Here, psychology was quantified. Gallup was developing statistical models to predict behavior, what people read, watched, and bought. For Ogilvy, who had relied on intuition and empathy, the rigor of Gallup's methods was transformative. He taught me to respect the research, Ogilvy later wrote. It is the best insurance against committing expensive errors. He spent his early American years immersed in data, learning how patterns of response could reveal the structure of belief. Yet what fascinated him most was the paradox that data alone could not explain why people felt compelled to buy or to believe. The numbers described behavior, but not the soul beneath it. That tension between measurement and mystery would remain at the heart of his thought. He revered research, but distrusted arrogance, the assumption that knowing the data meant understanding the human. When war broke out in Europe, Ogilvy remained in America. He worked briefly for Gallup's British division and later for the British Embassy's intelligence service in Washington, contributing psychological reports and propaganda analysis. The experience was his first encounter with persuasion as a political weapon in the same landscape Bernays had mapped years earlier. He saw how messages could rally nations, how symbols could mobilize fear or hope. Yet he also saw the moral danger of such tools when untethered from honesty. Propaganda is what advertising would become if we lost our conscience, he later remarked in a private note. By the time the war ended, Ogilvy was in his mid-30s, a man without a fixed career but rich in experience. He had been a chef, a salesman, a pollster, and a diplomat of sorts. Each role had taught him something about human behavior, the discipline of precision, the art of empathy, the power of evidence, and the ethics of persuasion. Those lessons would fuse in 1948 when, with no clients and little capital, he founded Hewitt, Ogilvy, Benson, and Mather in New York, the agency that would make his name and define post-war advertising. But before that transformation, the essential Ogilvy was already formed. An outsider who revered method, a rationalist who studied emotion, and a moralist who entered a field built on seduction. His early life had given him the tools of a craftsman and the conscience of a skeptic. What he lacked in pedigree, he compensated for in purpose. The chaos of Depression-era England, the rigor of Paris kitchens, the humility of door-to-door sales, all had taught him that persuasion was not trickery, but translation. It was the act of rendering desire into language. By the time he reached New York, the world was ready for men like him, men who understood that the great project of modernity was no longer to conquer nature, but to interpret the mind. The age of public persuasion had begun, and David Ogilvy was about to become its most articulate craftsman. Ogilvy's formal education ended abruptly, but the education that mattered to him was only beginning. His time at Oxford, brief, disorganized, and unfinished, left him with both an admiration for disciplined thought and a distaste for its isolation. He absorbed the intellectual manners of the place, its clarity, irony, and reverence for language, but he rebelled against its detachment from life. He had studied under men like Roy Harrod and Keith Filing, historians and economists who saw knowledge as an instrument of order, not imagination. Ogilvy's later writing, even when it sold soap, bore traces of that Oxford cadence, precise, declarative, measured, yet what he retained most was the sense that truth, however elusive, must be pursued with structure. "I can't abide looseness," he once said. "Even inspiration must be organized." When he left Oxford, the world outside was collapsing into depression. In 1931, Britain's unemployment exceeded 2 million. The gold standard had failed, banks were faltering, and whole professions were vanishing. For a young man with no degree and few prospects, the ordinary avenues of ambition were closed. Ogilvy's classmates entered law, government, or the academy. He went into kitchens and kitchens into sales. It was an exile from expectation, but one that inoculated him against the illusions of class that shaped English life. He came to see hierarchy not as a measure of talent, but of access, and he carried that skepticism into his later leadership. In an industry of pedigrees, he hired on merit, not manners. The most important classroom he ever entered was not at Oxford, but in the cramped kitchens of the Hotel Majestic. There, amid the heat, profanity, and hierarchy of a Paris brigade, he encountered the discipline of craft. The head chef, Monsieur Pitard, ran his kitchen with the precision of a military unit. Ogilvy, then in his early 20s, learned that excellence required repetition, not inspiration. Each sauce, each plate, each gesture had to meet a standard that existed before the cook himself. It was a lesson in apprenticeship, a structure of learning that would later shape how he managed copywriters and account men. "I still write advertisements myself," he would later explain in Confessions of an Advertising Man, "to remind my brigade that my hand has not lost its cunning." The kitchen was a crucible of authority, a living model for leadership through mastery. From Pitard, he learned that the right to command came only from demonstrated excellence, never from rank alone. When the Depression deepened, Ogilvy left Paris for England. The country was gray with austerity, industries shrank, and the certainties of empire seemed to dissolve. He wandered through odd jobs until the AGA Cooker Company hired him as a door-to-door salesman. It was here that Ogilvy's instinct for psychology found a field. Selling cookers to housewives in the Midlands demanded not rhetoric, but empathy. "The good salesman," he wrote in his manual, "knows that the customer is not buying a machine. She is buying comfort, pride, and the approval of her friends." That observation, the alignment of material need with emotional aspiration, became the cornerstone of his later theory of advertising. His sales manual for AGA circulated privately, but achieved near-mythic status in business circles. It advised not only on persuasion, but on ethics. Never deceive, never patronize, always listen. It was already Ogilvyian in tone, confident, courteous, and empirical. He tested lines, gestures, and openings with the rigor of an experiment. He realized that persuasion worked best when it affirmed rather than manipulated. The salesman, he believed, must inhabit the consumer's perspective. That insistence on respect would later distinguish his advertising from the cynicism of Madison Avenue. The AGA years also taught him another lesson, that boredom was fatal. The worst sin, whether in sales or copy, was dullness. He noticed that even the most practical buyers responded to personality, to warmth, wit, and rhythm in speech. He once compared a well-crafted sales pitch to a sonata. Variation mattered as much as content. Years later, when he began to write advertisements, his copy carried that same musical instinct, pauses, cadences, and the conversational intimacy of a voice speaking directly to another human being. His transition from salesman to researcher was improbable. In 1938, through a family connection, Ogilvy was introduced to George Gallup, whose pioneering work in opinion polling was transforming American political life. Gallup hired him for his Audience Research Institute, where advertising and social science converged. Ogilvy's assignment was to study audience response to motion pictures, a statistical analysis of what people noticed, remembered, or ignored. For the first time, he saw persuasion translated into measurable data. He learned that what people said they liked often diverged from what they actually remembered. This gap between declared preference and unconscious behavior fascinated him. It was the same space Bernays had exploited, the hidden life beneath awareness, but Ogilvy treated it with scientific curiosity, not manipulation. Under Gallup, he learned discipline in testing hypotheses and humility before evidence. If you ever find yourself in a conflict between intuition and research, he would later tell his copywriters, trust the research. Yet he also knew that data could never replace imagination. Gallup taught him to measure, but not to dream. The dream, the big idea, would always come from the artist within the empiricist. When the war began, Ogilvy left the Institute to work for British intelligence in Washington. He served under Sir William Stevenson at the British Security Coordination Office, the covert organization responsible for espionage and propaganda in the Western Hemisphere. There he wrote confidential reports on morale, psychological warfare, and public sentiment. He learned how governments manufactured belief, the architecture of persuasion on a national scale. But he also saw the moral line between communication and control. His wartime experience confirmed for him that persuasion was a tool of power, one that could enlighten or deceive depending on the conscience of its wielder. After the war, restless and unwilling to return to England's rationed austerity, Ogilvy bought a farm in Pennsylvania. He and his wife raised Amish hens, grew vegetables, and lived in deliberate simplicity. Those years of rural isolation formed his sense of proportion. He observed how the Amish sustained an entire moral universe without advertising, without slogans, without spectacle. A community bound by mutual respect and craftsmanship. The Amish have no need of persuasion, he wrote later. Their work is its own advertisement. This period of voluntary obscurity steadied him. He read widely, studied American commerce, and waited for his next venture.
Well, I wanted to go in the agency business, New York, and there was only one agency I wanted to work for, and that was Young & Rubicam. I was tremendously impressed by them, and by Raymond Rubicam in particular. I wanted to work there, but I didn't think I could ever get a job there. I had no qualifications, no credentials. I didn't even dare ask. So the only alternative was to start my own, which is what I did.
In 1948, he made his move. With financial backing from two British agencies, Mather and Crowther and S.H. Benson, and modest American partners, he founded a new firm in New York, Hewitt, Ogilvy, Benson, and Mather. He was 37 years old, had never written an advertisement, and had no clients. What he did have was a philosophy: respect the consumer, use research intelligently, and write with clarity. He rejected the bombast of post-war American advertising, which thrived on shouting and spectacle. He wanted advertising to be literate, persuasive, and dignified. His ambition was not to charm Madison Avenue, but to reform it. He hung on his office wall a sign that read, "We sell or else." To him, advertising was not art or entertainment. It was applied psychology in the service of commerce. Yet his conception of selling was moral, not mechanical. He saw persuasion as an act of translation, understanding what people truly wanted and articulating it in language that dignified both product and buyer. His early campaigns reflected that ethos: simple headlines, clear benefits, impeccable logic, and an undertone of civility. His heroes were not artists, but craftsmen: Claude Hopkins, Albert Lasker, and Francis Bacon, whose aphorisms on clarity he could recite from memory. Ogilvy's education had been unconventional, but it had prepared him for precisely this moment. Oxford had taught him form, the kitchen taught him discipline, Gallup taught him evidence, and sales taught him empathy. When these threads converged on Madison Avenue, they produced a new type of advertising mind, one that joined rigor with imagination, method with emotion. He was no theorist. He was a practitioner who turned philosophy into profit. In his own way, Ogilvy completed the circle Bernays had begun. Where Bernays used psychology to manipulate, Ogilvy used it to communicate. Both recognized that beneath reason lay the emotional architecture of choice. But Ogilvy's respect for the consumer, born of listening to housewives and honed by research, made his version of persuasion less cynical, more human. He understood that the line between influence and coercion was not technical, but ethical. By the time his agency's first major accounts arrived, among them Rolls-Royce, Dove, and Schweppes, Ogilvy had already forged his credo. "Tell the truth," he would say, "but make it fascinating." It was the credo of a man educated not by universities, but by experience, a philosopher of persuasion who believed that the most powerful form of influence was honesty rendered with precision. When David Ogilvy opened the doors of his new agency on Madison Avenue in 1948, he had neither credentials nor clients. His capital was $6,000, his office was borrowed, and his reputation non-existent. Yet he possessed what he later called a hopeless optimism, the conviction that reason and craft could prevail in an industry addicted to noise. He issued an internal memo, almost a manifesto. "This is a new agency struggling for its life. For some time we shall be overworked and underpaid. We are looking for young Turks, not toadies or hacks. Agencies are as big as they deserve to be." That first year, he secured a handful of minor accounts: Wedgwood China, a hairbrush manufacturer, a motorcycle firm. But Ogilvy's ambition far exceeded his scale. He made a list of the 5 clients he wanted most: General Foods, Bristol-Myers, Campbell's Soup, Lever Brothers, and Shell. It was an act of presumption bordering on delusion. All 5 were multinational giants served by established agencies. Yet within 15 years, every one of them would be his client. The early work was intense and personal. Ogilvy wrote nearly every advertisement himself, managed each account, and interviewed every hire. He worked from morning until midnight, 6 days a week, driven by the conviction that excellence, not expansion, would secure permanence. His insistence on quality and civility clashed with the prevailing culture of Madison Avenue, where flamboyance and cynicism were the currencies of success. The pursuit of excellence is less profitable than the pursuit of bigness, he admitted, but it is more satisfying. The agency's first major break came with Schweppes, the British tonic water brand. The company wanted to expand in the United States, but was burdened by an image problem. Americans saw tonic water as medicinal, not pleasurable. Ogilvy's solution was to reframe it through personality. He invented a spokesman, Commander Edward Whitehead, the managing director of Schweppes, and made him the face of the brand. In the advertisements, Whitehead stood aloof, bearded, impeccably dressed, speaking with the dry confidence of a man who needed neither approval nor explanation. The campaign introduced America to the word Schweppervescence, a coined blend of wit and effervescence, and turned Whitehead into a minor celebrity. The success established Ogilvy as the master of brand personality. Every advertisement is a long-term investment in the image of a brand, he wrote, distilling a truth that would become an axiom of modern marketing. His next triumph came with Hathaway Shirts, a company facing stagnant sales in a crowded market. Most shirt ads of the time relied on literal imagery: clean collars, handsome models, vague claims of quality. Ogilvy, drawing on his fascination with character, added one detail: an eye patch. The model, Baron George Wrangel, a Russian émigré, wore a black patch that suggested mystery and adventure. No explanation was given. The image was magnetic. People projected their fantasies onto the unknown man. Was he a war hero, a sailor, a spy? The campaign sold shirts, but more importantly, it sold myth. It demonstrated Ogilvy's principle that the strongest advertisements are not those that explain, but those that imply. It's the story within the picture that persuades, he said later. The consumer completes it in their own imagination. This ability to balance narrative and restraint distinguished Ogilvy's work from the manipulative sensationalism of many contemporaries. Where others shouted, he whispered. His ads assumed intelligence in the reader, inviting engagement rather than commanding it. It was a tone of respect, born from his early years as a salesman, and refined by his exposure to Gallup's research. He saw consumers not as targets, but as participants in meaning-making. His writing style, clear, confident, often conversational, read like the speech of a man who had thought before speaking. Write as you talk, he instructed his staff naturally and as though you were addressing a friend across the table. The campaign that sealed his reputation came in 1958 with Rolls-Royce. The company wanted to appeal to American buyers without vulgarity. Ogilvy began, as always, with research. Weeks spent reading technical manuals and engineering notes. Buried in the documentation, he found a single line from the chief engineer. At 60 miles an hour, the loudest noise in this new Rolls-Royce comes from the electric clock. That became his headline. Beneath it ran 607 words of meticulous copy describing the car's mechanical perfection. No exclamation points, no slogans, no actors, only craftsmanship rendered in prose. It was not advertising as hyperbole, but advertising as truth. The ad produced an immediate surge in sales and became one of the most famous in history. Decades later, advertising students would still memorize it as the gold standard of research-based creativity. For Ogilvy, the Rolls-Royce ad embodied his entire philosophy: precision in research, elegance in execution, and honesty in tone. He despised vague superlatives: better, best, new. The consumer, he warned, does not buy slogans. She buys facts, yet his facts were never dull. He transformed technical detail into poetry, writing copy that felt authoritative without feeling cold. In this, he resembled a scientific humanist, a man who believed that truth, clearly told, was the most persuasive language of all. Another of his enduring campaigns was for Dove. In the 1950s, Lever Brothers introduced Dove as a moisturizing soap in a market dominated by ivory. Ogilvy's insight was to position it not as a soap at all, but as a beauty bar. His research revealed that women disliked the dryness caused by ordinary soap, but distrusted exaggerated beauty claims. The solution was to fuse modesty with science. The ad declared, "Only Dove is 1/4 moisturizing cream." That single line transformed the brand. It gave Dove a unique identity, gentle, empirical, and trustworthy, that endures to this day. The campaign established the idea of product differentiation as emotional positioning, a concept that later became central to modern branding. Ogilvy's genius lay not only in writing, but in systems thinking. He treated advertising as an ecosystem where research, creativity, and management had to align. In Confessions of an Advertising Man, he outlined his method. First, understand the product intimately. Second, study the consumer without condescension. Third, find the story that connects them both. If you ever find yourself short of ideas, he wrote, go read your client's product literature. His respect for the material facts of a product set him apart from the emerging generation of art directors in the 1960s who prized irony and shock over substance. He was, in his own phrase, a Puritan in an age of showmen. His management philosophy was as distinct as his copy. He structured Ogilvy and Mather as a creative meritocracy rather than a bureaucracy. He believed that good ideas were fragile and had to be protected from committees. Search all the parks in all your cities, he wrote. You'll find no statues of committees. He managed by inspiration rather than intimidation, insisting on intellectual honesty, curiosity, and hard work. His internal memos were legendary, witty, exact, and occasionally brutal in their precision. To his staff he wrote, I admire people who work hard, who bite the bullet. I dislike passengers who don't pull their weight in the boat. Yet beneath the severity was paternal care. He saw himself as a chef once again, orchestrating a brigade in pursuit of excellence. By the mid-1960s, Ogilvy and Mather had grown into one of the most respected agencies in the world, with offices in New York, London, and Toronto. Its clients included Shell, Guinness, American Express, and Sears. The firm's success owed less to flamboyance than to consistency. Ogilvy insisted on written principles, a company credo that stressed client service, honesty, and the primacy of creative work. He called it the likeness doctrine, that an agency's reputation must resemble the quality of its work. Profit was a consequence, not a goal. His campaigns for American Express and Puerto Rico tourism expanded the scope of advertising from products to experiences. For American Express, he emphasized prestige and security, elevating a mere credit card into a symbol of belonging to a global elite. His line, membership has its privileges, reframed finance as identity. For Puerto Rico, he rebranded the island from a poor Caribbean territory into a place of renaissance and charm. The tourism campaign quadrupled visitor numbers in a decade. It was, Ogilvy observed, the only instance I know where advertising changed the image of an entire country. What unified these diverse successes was his fidelity to the idea of the brand as a living organism, an identity built slowly through consistent tone and truth. In Ogilvy on advertising, he warned against the fad of constant reinvention. Every time you blow your brand up and start again, he wrote, you waste the money you spent on yesterday. His devotion to continuity made him unfashionable during the creative revolutions of the late 1960s, when younger advertisers like Bill Bernbach at Doyle Dane Bernbach emphasized emotional storytelling and visual irony. Ogilvy respected Bernbach's talent but distrusted the new casualness. When I write an advertisement, he said, I don't want you to tell me that you find it creative. I want you to find it so interesting that you buy the product. He never claimed to be an artist. He called himself a craftsman. Yet his craftsmanship altered the course of an art. He demonstrated that persuasion could be intelligent, that clarity could be beautiful, and that respect could sell. His method fused research and imagination into a discipline that anticipated modern behavioral economics, the study of how rational and emotional factors coexist in decision-making. Decades before the term data-driven creativity entered the lexicon, Ogilvy had already practiced it. His relationship with clients reflected his dual identity as both gentleman and empiricist. He treated them as partners, not patrons. In Confessions, he devoted an entire chapter to teaching clients how to be good clients, to trust their agencies, to define objectives clearly, and to respect the creative process. Advertising, he wrote, is a partnership of intellects. Distrust destroys it. His candor earned him loyalty from executives who valued competence over charm, but he also knew how to use theater when it mattered. When presenting a new campaign, he would speak with deliberate calm, letting silence magnify confidence. He understood that persuasion was as much about atmosphere as argument, an insight that echoed Bernays' psychology but expressed in gentler form. By the 1970s, Ogilvy and Mather had become a global institution. Ogilvy himself, increasingly withdrawn from daily management, moved to France and later to Tuffeau, a 12th century chateau he purchased in the Loire Valley. From there, he wrote memos, books, and letters that distilled his principles into aphorisms. His French neighbors called him le publicitaire anglais, the English advertiser, but he preferred applied idealist. He saw his work not as manipulation, but as communication elevated to craft. Advertising, he said, is not evil. It's the literature of desire. Yet, beneath his optimism lingered the same question that had haunted Bernays and Freud, whether persuasion, however benevolent, could remain free of control. Ogilvy's answer was moral rather than theoretical. The consumer, he wrote, is not to be fooled. If you tell lies about your product, you will be found out and punished by the market. For him, honesty was not virtue signaling, it was practical survival. In a world saturated with claims, only truth could endure repetition. In the final years of his career, Ogilvy looked with suspicion at the growing use of advertising psychology and subliminal manipulation. He warned that treating consumers as data points risked reviving the very elitism that Bernays had institutionalized. Don't treat people as targets, he told a conference in 1983. Treat them as readers, as citizens. It was a quiet echo of his earliest conviction, that persuasion should illuminate, not exploit. His life's work had begun in an age that sought to control the unconscious. It ended in an era trying to measure it. Between those poles, David Ogilvy built an empire of reason, a belief that truth, clearly told, could sell anything worth selling. When Confessions of an Advertising Man appeared in 1963, it was an anomaly. Most business books of the era were instructional or defensive, written in the jargon of commerce. Ogilvy's book was neither. It was a confession in the literal sense, part memoir, part manual, part meditation on the art of persuasion. It was written in his own voice, free of academic pretension or corporate polish. The tone was direct, elegant, and unapologetically opinionated. It read less like a treatise and more like a personal testament to discipline. I have a theory, he wrote, that the best way to keep the reader's attention is to be interesting. In form, it resembled the self-help literature of Dale Carnegie or the aphoristic clarity of Bacon's essays, but its content was pure craft. Each chapter dealt with a different dimension of advertising, how to manage an agency, how to win clients, how to make advertisements that sell. Yet beneath the practical instruction ran a deeper current, a vision of advertising as moral labor. Ogilvy presented the industry not as a playground for cleverness, but as a profession with ethical obligations to truth, to clarity, and to respect for the consumer's intelligence. You cannot bore people into buying your product, he declared. You can only interest them in buying it. The book became an instant success. It was serialized in the New York Times, translated into more than a dozen languages, and used in university courses on marketing, communication, and management. For many young copywriters, it became scripture. Ogilvy himself was startled by the reception. He had written the book as an internal guide for his agency, not as a public manifesto. Yet the post-war generation of advertisers, adrift between cynicism and art, found in his prose a code of integrity. Confessions redefined what it meant to be both creative and accountable. It is easy to forget that at the time of its publication, advertising was in the midst of a cultural crisis. The 1950s had produced an avalanche of criticism, from sociologists like Vance Packard, whose The Hidden Persuaders accused advertisers of manipulating subconscious desires, to artists and journalists who saw Madison Avenue as a factory of conformity. Against that backdrop, Ogilvy's book offered a quiet rebuttal. That persuasion need not corrupt. He insisted that good advertising was not psychological manipulation, but lucid communication. His honesty about the commercial motive, we sell or else, was disarming. It suggested that commerce could coexist with candor if pursued with intelligence. One of the book's most enduring contributions was its articulation of the consumer as partner. Ogilvy rejected both the manipulative tone of propaganda and the sentimental flattery of post-war advertising. Instead, he argued that advertising should speak to the consumer as an equal. This humanist stance distinguished him from Edward Bernays, whose Engineering of Consent treated audiences as psychological subjects to be guided. Ogilvy's engineering was linguistic and moral. The consumer, he wrote, is not a moron, she's your wife. You insult her intelligence if you assume that a mere slogan and a few vapid adjectives will persuade her to buy anything. She wants all the information you can give her. That line, sometimes misunderstood as paternalistic, was in fact revolutionary. It elevated the consumer from object to interlocutor. It assumed literacy, discernment, and agency. In a field built on manipulation, Ogilvy restored dignity to the audience. His idea of persuasion was dialogical rather than coercive. He believed that an advertisement should read like a conversation between competent adults. If you think advertising is science, you're wrong, he wrote. If you think it's art, you're even more wrong. Advertising is a form of communication, clear thinking made visible. The influence of Confessions of an Advertising Man extended far beyond Madison Avenue. In management theory, it became a model of clarity and leadership. Business schools used it to illustrate the relationship between creative autonomy and organizational discipline. In literature departments, it was cited as an example of modern plain style, the art of precision without austerity. The philosopher Gilbert Ryle, reviewing it for the Times Literary Supplement, praised it as a textbook of intellect applied to commerce. Even critics of capitalism found themselves quoting Ogilvy's aphorisms for their linguistic purity. 20 years later, Ogilvy on Advertising appeared. The world it entered was utterly changed. The 1980s had made marketing more global, more data-driven, and more self-conscious. The creative revolution led by Bill Bernbach had turned advertising into an art form, sometimes at the expense of clarity. Ogilvy, semi-retired and writing from his French chateau, felt the need to restate his case. The book was both a defense of his methods and a warning against the excesses of fashion. I am not a born writer, he began. I am an advertising man. The modesty was deceptive. Few books have ever explained persuasion with such lucidity. If Confessions was written in the heat of practice, Ogilvy on Advertising was written in the calm of mastery. It distilled 40 years of experience into axioms. Every chapter followed the same principle he applied to copy: brevity, clarity, utility. It was illustrated with his own campaigns, Hathaway, Dove, Rolls-Royce, Shell, and Guinness, not as vanity, but as case studies in evidence-based creativity. The book's design itself embodied his philosophy. Minimal typography, no excess decoration, information first. He treated layout as argument. Tell the truth, but make it fascinating, he repeated. A line that could serve as the credo of journalism as much as advertising. In tone, Ogilvy on Advertising was more pedagogical than confessional. It addressed the industry's next generation, the students, art directors, and account managers who had grown up amid television and were facing the dawn of global media. Ogilvy sensed the encroachment of spectacle and sought to remind them that substance still mattered. What you say in advertising is more important than how you say it, he insisted. If you haven't got a good product, all the advertising in the world won't save it. This pragmatic humanism, the belief that truth itself was persuasive, made him both timeless and unfashionable. Academically, the book bridged two traditions: the behavioral psychology of the mid-century and the emerging science of marketing analytics. Ogilvy's insistence on research anticipated later developments in consumer behavior and data-driven marketing. He advocated continuous testing long before A/B testing or digital metrics existed, yet he warned against the tyranny of numbers. Never use research as a drunkard uses a lamppost, he wrote, for support rather than illumination. In those lines lay a subtle philosophy of knowledge, that empiricism must serve insight, not replace it. Ogilvy on advertising also crystallized his theory of brand image. The concept was not new. Earlier advertisers like Claude Hopkins had recognized the power of consistency, but Ogilvy elevated it to principle. Every advertisement contributes to the complex symbol, which is the brand image, he wrote. Advertising is the means by which you can control that image. To him, a brand was not a product, but a personality, a set of values made visible through tone, typography, and truth. In modern terms, he was defining semiotics before it had entered marketing vocabulary. Each color, each word, each photograph was a signifier contributing to an identity greater than the sum of its parts. His approach anticipated the later disciplines of brand strategy, identity design, and corporate narrative. The book's influence in universities was profound. It entered the syllabi of business schools at Harvard, Wharton, and London Business School, not merely as a guide to advertising, but as an exemplar of clarity in managerial writing. Scholars in communication studies cited Ogilvy's work as early evidence of integrated marketing communication, the alignment of message, medium, and motive. The very phrase, the big idea, which he used throughout, entered the lexicon of media theory as shorthand for conceptual clarity amid saturation. His aphorisms became corporate scripture: don't bunt, aim out of the park, never stop testing. If each of us hires people smaller than we are, we shall become a company of dwarfs. If each of us hires people bigger than we are, we shall become a company of giants. Yet beneath the managerial wisdom, there was a moral argument running through both books. Ogilvy was defending not merely a method, but a worldview, that honesty and intelligence were not enemies of commerce, but its conditions. He saw truth as competitive advantage. This conviction made him a rare figure in the capitalist century, a moral realist. There is no trickery in good advertising, he wrote, only clarity. The trickery is in bad advertising, which tries to sell what should not be sold. In the academic world, his ideas sparked debate about the ethics of persuasion. Was honesty merely strategic, or did it constitute virtue? Scholars of business ethics later used Ogilvy as a case study in what they called instrumental integrity, the idea that virtue could be both moral and profitable. He anticipated the modern discourse on corporate social responsibility without its jargon. When he wrote that advertising reflects the society it serves, he meant it as both observation and warning. An honest society could sustain honest advertising, a corrupt one could not. In literary terms, Ogilvy's writing style was part of his influence. He wrote in short, declarative sentences. He preferred verbs to adjectives. He avoided metaphor unless it clarified. His prose combined the authority of a manual with the intimacy of conversation. Students of rhetoric have compared his style to George Orwell's essay, Politics and the English Language. Both men distrusted abstraction and believed that clear language was a moral act. In this, Ogilvy bridged the worlds of commerce and letters, demonstrating that precision could humanize persuasion. The legacy of his books extended beyond the printed page. They reshaped the identity of advertising as a profession. Before Ogilvy, advertising was seen as a hybrid of salesmanship and show business, intuitive, mercurial, and morally ambiguous. After Ogilvy, it aspired to the status of a discipline, empirical, teachable, and principled. His writings became the foundation of countless training programs in agencies worldwide. At Ogilvy and Mather, new recruits were required to read Confessions in Ogilvy on advertising before touching a client account. To this day, his principles, research, clarity, honesty, form the scaffolding of corporate communication manuals across industries. In the decades that followed, as universities built departments of marketing, consumer psychology, and media studies, Ogilvy's name appeared alongside those of Kotler, Drucker, and Bernbach. He had no doctorate, no formal academic post, yet his thinking was more widely taught than that of most professors. He was an accidental theorist, one who extracted principle from practice. In a field too often divided between art and analytics, his synthesis of the two gave advertising an intellectual spine. Toward the end of Ogilvy on advertising, he posed a question that summarized his career: what's the future of advertising? His answer was neither prophetic nor nostalgic. The future, he wrote, belongs to those who can blend research and imagination, who can use technology without losing humanity. That single line predicted the entire digital age. In the 21st century, when algorithms and behavioral data shape communication, Ogilvy's insistence on respect for the consumer feels less quaint than prescient. He died before the rise of the internet, but his writings foresaw its ethical paradox, that technology would give unprecedented power to persuasion while eroding the boundary between communication and manipulation. His enduring influence in academia lies precisely there, in articulating the moral geometry of persuasion. He saw that every act of communication, however commercial, participates in the construction of culture. His books endure because they teach not merely how to sell, but how to speak truth in a world that rewards illusion. When David Ogilvy retired from day-to-day management in the early 1970s, the world he had helped define was already changing beyond recognition. The Mad Men era, which his rigor had dignified and his discipline had restrained, was dissolving into something noisier, more ironic, and less reverent. The counterculture had turned advertising itself into a symbol of manipulation. Agencies like Doyle, Dane, Bernbach, and Saatchi were championing emotional storytelling, shock, and wit as the new currency of persuasion. To many of the young art directors and copywriters who came of age in that moment, Ogilvy seemed almost archaic, a gentleman of order in a culture of disruption. Yet with time, his principles proved more adaptable than his critics imagined. As the industry swung between intuition and data, cynicism and sincerity, Ogilvy's balance of intellect and empathy endured. What began as a personal creed, research, respect, clarity, became the invisible grammar of responsible advertising. He spent his later years at Château de Touffu, a 12th century fortress overlooking the River Vienne in France. From its high windows, he would send hundreds of letters to colleagues and clients, written in his distinctive style. Precise, wry, and courtly, he disdained nostalgia but remained attentive to change. Advertising, he wrote from Touffu, is always being reinvented by people who think it was never invented properly in the first place. He watched the rise of television, the birth of global agencies, and the early stirrings of computer-based media. His advice remained constant. Tools change, but the psychology of persuasion does not. People still buy products, he said, for the same reasons they always have, because they believe something about them. During the 1980s and 1990s, Ogilvy's influence extended well beyond advertising. As globalization accelerated, multinational corporations sought a unified way to communicate across cultures. Ogilvy's idea of the brand image, coherent, consistent, rooted in truth, became the foundation of modern brand management. The world's emerging giants, from IBM to Coca-Cola to Unilever, built their corporate narratives on principles he had articulated decades earlier. The very phrase brand equity, which entered management vocabulary in the late 1980s, owed much to his insistence that advertising was an investment in reputation, not a momentary sale. His intellectual heirs in marketing, scholars like Philip Kotler, Theodore Levitt, and later Kevin Keller, expanded his intuition into formal theory. They quantified brand personality, loyalty, and trust, giving academic language to what Ogilvy had practiced instinctively. Yet even as marketing became more scientific, the ethical dimension he championed faded. Research can reveal what people do, he had warned, but not what they ought to do. It was the distinction between knowledge and wisdom, one that the algorithmic age would blur. In the 1990s, as digital communication emerged, Ogilvy's writings acquired new relevance. The internet, with its infinite data and collapsing attention spans, revived the very dilemmas he had wrestled with 40 years earlier. How to hold attention without deception, how to personalize without intrusion. His maxim, "The consumer is not a moron, she's your wife," took on new meaning in a world where consumers could talk back. Online advertising forced the industry to rediscover his emphasis on honesty, clarity, and respect. As digital clutter multiplied, the simplicity of his layouts and the human tone of his copy became models for effective communication. Ogilvy's belief in research also found an unlikely echo in the data-driven revolution. The analytics departments of Google, Facebook, and Amazon, with their experiments in consumer behavior and A/B testing, were practicing a form of applied Gallup, scaled to billions. He would have admired the precision, but distrusted the motive. Never confuse measurement with meaning, he had written. The difference was crucial. His research served the goal of understanding people. Much of modern data serves the goal of predicting them. That distinction defines his modern legacy. Where Edward Bernays sought to engineer consent by manipulating the unconscious, the digital platforms of the 21st century do so by quantifying it. Behavioral advertising, personalization, and algorithmic recommendation are, in a sense, the industrial descendants of both Freud and Ogilvy, the fusion of psychological insight with computational scale. Yet where Ogilvy used empathy and observation, the new systems use surveillance and correlation. The ethical line he drew, that persuasion should respect autonomy, now runs through every debate on data privacy and algorithmic design. Many of Ogilvy's principles have been adopted, often unconsciously, by digital communicators. His insistence that you cannot bore people into buying your product anticipated the modern obsession with engagement. His view that the best ideas come as jokes prefigured the meme economy, where humor drives virality. Yet, what is missing from much of digital persuasion is the restraint that defined him, the sense that clarity is not just an aesthetic, but a form of respect. In a world of infinite noise, his plain style has become radical again. In the academic realm, his influence persists through the ethical framework he embedded in practice. Business schools teach Confessions of an Advertising Man, not only as a manual for marketing, but as a case study in moral leadership. Communication scholars cite him as a transitional figure between propaganda and participatory media, the first major advertiser to argue that persuasion must preserve choice. His writings anticipated later theories of relational communication and dialogic marketing, which hold that audiences are not passive, but co-creators of meaning. Ogilvy had already said as much in 1963. The more you know about your customer, the more she will trust you, and when she trusts you, she will listen. In the corporate world, his name became a brand in itself. Ogilvy and Mather, later simply Ogilvy, expanded into over 80 countries, managing accounts for the largest companies on Earth. Its training programs institutionalized his methods, and his internal memos became required reading for recruits. Even decades after his death, new employees received The Eternal Pursuit of Unhappiness, a book compiling his philosophies on creativity, discipline, and curiosity. The irony was that the very agency he built to resist conformity became one of the most consistent institutions in modern communication, a testament to the power of principles over fashion. His legacy also extends to the sociology of professionalism. Before Ogilvy, advertising was considered a trade, noisy, unrefined, and morally suspect. He helped elevate it to a profession comparable to law or architecture, with its own code of ethics and craftsmanship. Advertising is not a science, he wrote, but it is not a game either. This sense of vocation, that to persuade responsibly is a civic act, influenced generations of marketers who viewed their work as cultural stewardship rather than mere commerce. In retrospect, Ogilvy's influence is as much philosophical as practical. He gave the advertising profession a conscience and a language to articulate it. His belief that the best ideas are often the simplest can be read not as advice, but as epistemology, simplicity as a form of truth. In this way, his work parallels other mid-century efforts to humanize complexity in design, Dieter Rams, in writing, George Orwell, and in management, Peter Drucker. Each sought clarity as a moral response to modernity's noise. When the digital revolution blurred the line between public and private life, Ogilvy's warnings about the limits of persuasion resurfaced. He had written, "If you tell lies about your product, you will be found out." The internet, with its transparency and collective memory, vindicated that maxim. Consumers could now expose deceit instantly. Honesty was not only ethical but algorithmically efficient. Brands that spoke plainly thrived. Those that manipulated collapsed under scrutiny. In that sense, the world had caught up to Ogilvy's moral realism, truth as long-term strategy. At the same time, the technologies of persuasion evolved in directions he might have feared. Behavioral targeting, psychological profiling, and neuromarketing reintroduced the very mechanisms of subconscious influence that he had sought to replace with clarity. The engineering of consent, once a metaphor, had become literal code. The algorithms that curate social media feeds and search results operate on Bernays' principle, shaping emotion beneath awareness, but with Ogilvy's efficiency. His legacy, therefore, stands as both foundation and warning that persuasion, untethered from conscience, can become control. Yet even within this transformation, his humanism survives. The most effective digital campaigns, from global brands to grassroots movements, still follow his basic laws: respect for the audience, clarity of message, authenticity of voice. His dictum that the consumer is your wife might now be translated as the consumer is you, a reminder that empathy, not surveillance, remains the soul of communication. Ogilvy's lasting contribution, then, is not confined to advertising. It is a theory of how truth travels through society. He demonstrated that persuasion could be both profitable and principled, that commerce could coexist with conscience. In this sense, his life forms a bridge between the manipulative optimism of Bernays and the algorithmic fatalism of the digital age. Both sought to shape human behavior. Ogilvy sought to understand it. The difference is moral, not mechanical. In the universities and agencies that still study him, Ogilvy is often described as a pragmatist, a man who turned ethics into efficiency. But that reading misses his deeper significance. His insistence on clarity was not merely practical, it was existential. He believed that civilization itself depended on intelligible communication. When people can no longer understand one another, he wrote, they cease to trust one another. In an age when discourse fractures under noise and manipulation, that insight feels almost prophetic. The paradox of his legacy is that it thrives in the very world he might have distrusted most. The digital marketplace, infinite, impersonal, and restless, continues to prove his point, that truth, simply told, endures. His campaigns have become case studies, his lines recycled as principles, his face, the sharply dressed Scotsman with a pipe, transformed into an icon of discipline in an era of flux. Yet his true inheritance lies not in slogans or style, but in method, the belief that respect for the audience is the foundation of persuasion. Ogilvy's influence can also be traced in the culture of professionalism that spans beyond advertising, in political communication, public relations, and design. His insistence that every message contributes to a larger image anticipated the era of personal branding, where individuals curate their own narratives much as corporations do. In that sense, the modern influencer, however distant from Ogilvy's decorum, is an unwitting heir to his vision of identity as communication. The irony is complete. A man who disliked self-promotion helped invent a world built on it. As artificial intelligence enters marketing, systems that can generate copy, test messages, and optimize persuasion without human intervention, Ogilvy's voice still echoes. He would have marveled at the tools but questioned the purpose. For him, persuasion without conscience was propaganda by another name. The real test, he once said, is not whether the ad sells, but whether it dignifies. In an era where algorithms can simulate empathy, his warning feels newly urgent. His legacy, finally, is ethical literacy, the understanding that to speak to millions is a responsibility, not a trick. In that sense, Ogilvy remains what he always was, the conscience of commerce. David Ogilvy died quietly on July 21st, 1999, at his home in the Loire Valley. He was 88 years old. The obituaries were respectful, even reverent, but often too small for the life they described. They called him the father of modern advertising, the last gentleman of Madison Avenue, the man who made selling respectable. Each phrase was accurate, but none conveyed the full weight of what he had done. He had not merely transformed an industry, he had redefined its ethics. He died as the world stood at the threshold of the digital millennium, a moment when the tools of persuasion were multiplying faster than their purposes could be questioned. The internet was barely a decade old. Algorithms were still innocent words, yet already the logic of marketing, of data, attention, and behavior was beginning to infiltrate every corner of life. In that sense, Ogilvy's death marked the end of one moral era and the beginning of another. He had spent his career trying to reconcile the power of persuasion with the dignity of reason. He believed that the mind could be influenced without being violated, that truth could persuade without deception. His entire philosophy rested on that fragile distinction. He treated the consumer as a free agent in a crowded marketplace of meaning, capable of discernment, worthy of respect. To him, the advertiser was not a manipulator of instincts, but a translator of desires. Advertising, he once said, should inform, not deform. That belief now feels almost utopian. The tools of persuasion have outgrown their human masters. Where Bernays used rhetoric and Freud's nephew spoke to the unconscious, today's systems speak directly to behavior. Nudging, predicting, optimizing. Consent has become measurable, even programmable. In such a world, Ogilvy's restraint seems like an act of resistance, the insistence that communication must remain human. He never wrote explicitly about mortality, but in his last letters from Tufu, he returned to the question that haunted his generation, whether the art of influence could coexist with the idea of freedom. The problem with controlling people, he wrote, is that you stop listening to them. That single sentence contains the moral gravity of his life's work. The purpose of advertising, he believed, was not to command attention, but to earn it, to listen first, to speak clearly, and to persuade through understanding. That was his quiet rebellion against the machinery of control. In the end, Ogilvy's achievement was not to perfect persuasion, but to humanize it. He proved that intellect could coexist with honesty, that clarity could sell, and that truth, when told with respect, was the most durable form of influence. His death did not close the age of advertising. It reminded it of its conscience. The question that framed his beginning, if the mind can be guided without awareness, where does freedom end and influence begin, remains unanswered. But in the life of David Ogilvy, it was at least asked with integrity. He built a career on the narrow space between control and communication, and in doing so, he left behind not a method, but a morality. That persuasion, when done with respect, is simply another way of telling the truth.
Be more ambitious. Don't bunt. When you get a job to do a storyboard or an ad, try and hit the ball out of the park every time. Don't bunt. Compete with the immortals. It's the lack of ambition which cripples most people and makes them so pedestrian in the advertising creative business.